The morning the truth began to crawl out from under decades of dust was not remarkable in any way. The sky hung low over Bryer County, gray and swollen with late summer humidity, the kind that made even the breeze feel heavy. Detective Laura Price sat in her kitchen, the faint hum of a refrigerator filling the silence. She had been up since 4, staring at the cold case files that had become her early morning ritual, the ones she told herself she only read because she hated idle hands. The truth was, the old cases were the only thing that made her feel something these days. The call came at 6:28. Her phone buzzed once, twice, and she almost ignored it. But when she saw the caller ID, State Crime Lab, she answered. The technician's voice on the other end trembled slightly, though he tried to sound steady. "Detective Price? We got the results back on that item from the Bryer file. You might want to sit down." Her heart slowed, her mind flicking through every piece of evidence she had submitted for reanalysis: soil samples, fibers, photographs. But deep down, she already knew which one he meant. The cup, that damn coffee cup, the one she had pulled from a crumbling cardboard box in the evidence room 3 weeks earlier, still sealed in its faded plastic sleeve. "What kind of results?" she asked, though she could already feel her pulse building in her throat. "DNA," the voice replied. "It's a hit." The case had haunted Bryer County for 20 years. October 2004. A young woman named Rachel Delaney, 22 years old, a nursing student and part-time waitress at Miller's Diner, vanished after her night shift. Her car was found parked neatly in front of her apartment building, keys in the ignition, purse on the seat, doors locked. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, no witnesses. On the passenger seat sat a styrofoam coffee cup, half full, no lid, lipstick mark along the rim. Detectives had dusted it, bagged it, logged it, and then lost interest when nothing came back from the lab. Without a body, the case had stalled within months. Theories ran wild. Runaway, lover's quarrel, random abduction. But the truth had slipped quietly into the cracks of memory. When Laura joined the department in 2016, she had no personal connection to the case. It was one of hundreds sitting dormant, its tab faded to yellow. But she had always been drawn to unsolved things. Maybe it was because she understood silence better than most, or maybe because her father had been a detective too, one who believed that the dead had a way of speaking to those who listened hard enough. Laura had made it her mission to listen. So she reopened the Delaney file, tracing the old reports like map lines, trying to see what others had missed. Rachel's life was ordinary, which made her disappearance all the more unbearable. She worked nights to pay for school, lived alone, and spent weekends helping her mother care for her younger brother, who had cerebral palsy. She was loved, known, rooted. There was no reason for her to leave, and no one close to her fit the profile of a killer. Except, perhaps, one name that kept reappearing in witness statements. The manager on duty that night, Eric Shaw. Shaw had been 28 in 2004, a quiet man with a reputation for reliability. He walked Rachel to her car after every shift, made sure she wasn't alone in the parking lot. When questioned after her disappearance, he claimed he'd gone stray home, logged into his computer, and chatted online until after midnight. His internet service provider confirmed the login times. He passed a polygraph. No motive, no evidence, case closed. In later years, he left the restaurant business and joined law enforcement, first as a dispatcher, then as a deputy in a neighboring county. When Laura first saw his name, it barely registered. She'd known an Eric Shaw once too, a fellow detective she'd worked beside in her first year. For a time, he had been more than that. They had shared late-night stakeouts, half-empty whiskey bottles, the kind of confessions that only come from people who mistake proximity for trust. It had ended without drama, just the quiet cooling that follows unspoken truths. He transferred north in 2019. She hadn't seen him since, but when she compared signatures in the file, her stomach turned. Same handwriting. Same man. She told herself it was coincidence. She'd seen coincidences before, names overlapping, histories repeating. Still, she couldn't ignore the pull of instinct. She authorized the cold case review, convincing her captain to allocate lab funding for modern DNA retesting. If we've got the samples, she'd said, we might as well give them a voice. The cup was almost a joke at first. What could possibly still cling to it after 2 decades in storage? But she sent it anyway. Now the technician's voice brought the past colliding into the present. We ran it 3 times, he said. Same result. 99.9% match to an Eric Shaw. You might want to check your files. The words hung in the air like the moment before a crash. Laura didn't respond right away. Her mind raced, calculating and refusing at the same time. She remembered his laugh, his meticulous handwriting, the way he'd always cleaned his desk before leaving the office. She remembered the faint scar on his knuckle, the one he said came from a bar fight in college. She remembered how once he told her that evidence never lies. Only people do. She thanked the technician, ended the call, and sat staring at her reflection in the dark window. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass. In the reflection, her face looked older than she felt. It occurred to her then that maybe justice wasn't always about peace. It was about weight. The weight of knowing. The weight of what truth demands. 2 days later, the warrant was signed. Laura wasn't supposed to be there when they brought him in. Conflict of interest, the chief had said. But she couldn't stay away. She stood behind the observation glass as Eric Shaw entered the interrogation room, escorted by 2 deputies. He looked different. Thinner, grayer, but still carrying that same quiet composure that had once made her trust him without question. When they read him his rights, he didn't protest. He just sat down, eyes fixed on the evidence table. The coffee cup rested there, sealed and labeled, a relic of a past life. "That's it?" he asked softly. "That's what got me?" His voice was calm, almost curious. Laura didn't answer, but she saw his hands tremble when the detective across the table slid the photograph toward him. Rachel Delaney, smiling beneath the diner's fluorescent lights, frozen forever in that ordinary moment. The first hour passed in silence. He denied nothing, confessed to nothing. Then, as if something inside him cracked, he began to speak. It came in fragments at first. A late-night drive, an argument, a mistake that turned into panic. He said Rachel had asked for a ride home that night. They drove out toward the quarry because she wanted to talk privately. She had been seeing someone else, and he couldn't handle it. He'd loved her, he said, but she didn't love him back. When she told him it was over, he lost control. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, eyes fixed on the table. "It happened too fast." He described the way she stopped moving, the silence that followed. He said he buried her near the quarry under loose rock and went home before dawn. The next morning, when detectives canvassed the diner, he'd handed over the same coffee cup, pretending to help. When the tape stopped recording, Laura remained in the observation room, numb. On the other side of the glass, Eric sat motionless, the fluorescent lights washing him pale. She tried to reconcile the man in front of her with the one she had once known, the one who had made her coffee on slow mornings and laughed when she forgot her keys. It felt impossible, but truth didn't care about feelings. It only cared about the evidence. The recovery team reached the quarry 3 days later. The air smelled of wet limestone and pine. They found what was left of Rachel exactly where he said, buried beneath 12 feet of earth and roots. Her necklace was still clasped, her bones arranged, as if she had been gently laid to rest. The crime scene technicians worked in silence, their faces drawn. For 20 years, her parents had waited for this moment, for something to bring their daughter home. The sheriff called them personally. Laura couldn't bring herself to go. News spread fast. Headlines read, "Alabama Cold Case. Solved after 2 decades? Local deputy arrested?" Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, and the story rippled through every household in Bryan County. People spoke in whispers at grocery stores, wondering how someone like Eric Shaw could have lived among them all these years, teaching safety workshops, coaching Little League, volunteering after floods. The betrayal was communal, a wound that reopened every time his name appeared on the evening news. For Laura, the aftermath was quieter, but heavier. She sat alone most nights in her office, the case file open in front of her, reading the same paragraphs until the words blurred. She thought about Rachel's mother, who had written a letter to the department every Christmas for 20 years, begging for an update. She thought about her own blindness, the months she'd spent sharing dinners and laughter with the man who had buried another woman in cold earth. There were no answers to soothe that. When the indictment came down, first-degree murder, obstruction, falsifying evidence, Eric didn't fight it. His lawyer arranged a plea to avoid the death penalty. During sentencing, he looked directly at Rachel's family and said nothing. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of air conditioning. Laura sat in the back row, hands folded, watching as the bailiff led him away in chains. She didn't cry. She hadn't since the day the lab called. That evening, as the sun sank over the courthouse, she drove out to the quarry alone. The excavation site was still cordoned off, yellow tape fluttering in the breeze. The soil was raw and uneven, scarred from the dig. She parked, turned off the engine, and listened. The wind carried the sound of distant thunder, rolling slow and low across the valley. In the fading light, the quarry looked like a wound, too. The land trying to heal itself. She got out, walked to the edge, and stood there until the light was gone. She thought about how easily trust becomes blindness, how thin the line is between protector and predator. She thought about Rachel, about the years stolen from her family, about the quiet persistence of truth. It had taken 20 years for justice to surface, and it had come wrapped in heartbreak. But it had come. The next morning, she returned to the office early. The evidence box sat on her desk, labeled "Case Closed." She lifted the lid and stared at the cup one last time. The faded diner logo, the faint lipstick smudge, the crack along the rim. She wondered if he'd kept it all those years in his memory, the same way she had unknowingly kept him in hers. Then she sealed the box, signed the closure form, and carried it down to archives herself. The custodian asked if she wanted to destroy the items or preserve them for training purposes. She hesitated. "Keep it," she said finally. "Some stories deserve to be remembered." Outside, the morning was bright, unreasonably beautiful. She stood in the parking lot, coffee in hand, and watched the sun climb over Bryan County's pine trees. The air smelled of rain and asphalt, and something faintly electric, as if the world itself had been rewired. She took a long sip and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt the quiet, not as a burden, but as a promise, one she intended to keep. The weeks after the verdict unfolded like a dream Laura couldn't wake from. Every morning she'd walk into the precinct, the same fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the same smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air. But everything felt slightly distorted, as if she were moving through a life that had shifted by a few degrees. The case was technically over. The press had moved on to newer scandals, fresher tragedies. Yet, in the quiet of her office, the ghosts remained. She could feel them in the hum of the air conditioner, in the shadows that stretched long across her desk at dusk. Sometimes she thought she heard Rachel's voice in the stillness. Nothing supernatural, just the echo of a story that refused to go silent. There was something about closing a case like that changed you. Justice, she had learned, wasn't clean. It didn't feel triumphant. It just weighed differently. A month after the sentencing, Laura received a letter from Rachel's mother. It was handwritten, careful and elegant, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who still believed words could hold meaning. "You gave us our daughter back," it read. "That doesn't make the pain smaller, but it makes the world make sense again. For that, we thank you." Laura stared at the page for a long time, her throat tight. She wanted to believe the words, wanted to think she had made something right. But she couldn't stop thinking about how long the truth had been buried, and how close she had once been to the man who'd hidden it. She folded the letter, placed it in her drawer, and didn't open it again. Fall came early that year, turning the Alabama fields gold before September was done. The courthouse lawn filled with fallen leaves, and Bryan County settled into a strange calm. On the surface, life moved forward. New cases, new officers, the small rhythms of rural law enforcement, but beneath it, a quiet unease lingered. People locked their doors sooner, trusted less easily, stared longer at familiar faces. The realization that one of their own had lived a double life had left an invisible crack through the heart of the community. For Laura, it was more personal. She couldn't look at her colleagues without wondering what shadows they carried, what histories they kept tucked behind polite smiles. One evening, as she packed her things to leave, her captain stopped by her office door. "Price," he said, leaning against the frame. "The state wants you to speak at the academy next month. Cold case methodology. Thought it'd be good for recruits to hear how you broke the Bryan file." She hesitated. The idea of standing in front of a classroom, explaining how her instincts had led her to the man she'd once loved, made her stomach twist. But she nodded anyway. "Sure," she said. "Send me the details." The captain smiled, grateful, and left her to the hum of her desk lamp. That night, she drove home on the back roads that wound through cotton fields and pine stands, headlights cutting through the dark like thin blades of truth. The radio played softly, static mixing with old blues. She thought about Eric, how he'd looked in the interrogation room, his voice calm, almost detached. He hadn't asked her for forgiveness. He hadn't offered apology. In some ways, that made it easier. In others, it left her with questions that would never be answered. She wondered if he had ever planned to tell her, if he'd ever felt the urge to confess during the years they'd shared dinners and cases and quiet mornings. Maybe not. Maybe he had convinced himself that part of him didn't exist anymore. But secrets, she knew, had long memories. They waited. At home, she poured herself a drink and sat on the porch, listening to the crickets rise and fall. Her house was small, perched at the edge of town, surrounded by fields that stretched into the distance. She'd bought it after her divorce, needing space that was hers alone. Some nights it felt peaceful. Others, it felt like a punishment. She stared out into the dark, the taste of bourbon sharp on her tongue, and thought of Rachel again. She tried to picture her alive, walking home that night, unaware of how quickly the world was about to shift. A young woman who trusted the wrong person, who never got the chance to see how cruel time could be. Laura closed her eyes, whispering to the night, "I'm sorry it took so long." The wind answered with nothing. The Academy lecture came faster than expected. On the morning of her presentation, Laura stood before a room of cadets, their faces bright and untested. She clicked through slides, crime scene photos, timelines, data points, but her voice stayed steady. She explained the importance of persistence, of re-examining evidence others had dismissed, of listening to the small inconsistencies that whisper the loudest truths. She didn't mention Eric by name, but when she described the suspect, her hands trembled slightly. The cadets took notes diligently, unaware of the ghost standing between her sentences. When it ended, one young officer approached her, eyes wide with admiration. "Ma'am," he said, "it must have felt incredible, finally solving a case like that." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It felt like the end of something," she said softly. "Not the kind of ending you celebrate." Driving back, the sky was streaked with the last light of day, the fields glowing orange and gold. She thought of her father again, how he used to say that every detective carries one case forever, the one that shapes who they are, the one that never quite leaves their bones. She knew now that the Breyer case was hers. It would follow her through every quiet night, every moment of stillness, a reminder of what truth costs. A few weeks later, a new file landed on her desk. Another disappearance, another young woman gone without a trace. The department wanted her on it, naturally. She agreed, though part of her hesitated. There was a risk in chasing ghosts, in seeing every shadow as familiar, but she couldn't refuse. This was what she did. It was what she had always done. The new case unfolded differently. Different town, different circumstances, but the same ache ran through it. Families begging for answers, neighbors whispering theories. Clues that refused to line up neatly. She found herself looking at every cup, every piece of discarded trash, every small detail, as if it might be another voice calling from the past. Late one night, alone in the evidence room, she pulled open the drawer marked Cold Case Archive, 2000-2010. The metal squealed softly. Inside were dozens of boxes, each one carrying a story that hadn't been finished. She ran her fingers along the spines, reading the names. She didn't open any of them that night. Instead, she turned off the light and walked outside into the damp Alabama air. The moon hung low, hazy and red through the mist. The town was asleep, unaware of the detective standing beneath the courthouse clock, wondering if closure was ever truly possible. The following spring brought storms, violent, unpredictable, and strangely fitting. Rain lashed against the courthouse windows as Laura worked through paperwork. A letter arrived from the Department of Justice. Eric Shaw had filed an appeal, claiming his confession was coerced. It wasn't unusual. Most convicts tried. Still, the thought of him sitting in a cell, writing appeals with the same calm detachment she remembered, made her chest tighten. She'd read somewhere that people like him don't feel guilt the way others do. They feel inconvenience, exposure, annoyance at being caught. She tried not to dwell on it. The hearing was brief, the appeal denied. When she left the courthouse, the rain had eased into drizzle. Across the street, an elderly man was locking up his hardware store. He looked at her and nodded. The kind of nod people give when they think they know your story, when they want to acknowledge it without saying a word. She nodded back. In small towns, silence often says more than speech. As summer crept closer, the Delaney family held a memorial at the community park. It had been 1 year since Rachel's body was found. The crowd was small: family, friends, a few officers. Laura stood near the back, unseen. She watched as Rachel's mother lit a candle, her hands steady despite the wind. "She was loved," the woman said, her voice trembling, "and she is remembered." Laura felt her throat close. When the ceremony ended, she waited until everyone had gone, then walked to the small plaque set in stone. It read simply, "In memory of Rachel Delaney, 1982-2004. May truth find its way home." Laura reached out, tracing the carved letters with her fingertips, the stone cool beneath her hand. That night, back at her house, she dreamed of water. She was standing in the quarry again, the sky turning from gold to gray, the ground opening beneath her feet. When she woke, dawn had barely touched the horizon. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. She dressed, poured herself coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the cup in both hands. For a long moment, she stared into the dark liquid, her reflection rippling at the surface. She wondered if the weight she carried would ever lessen, or if justice always demanded its due from those who served it. Weeks turned into months. She worked cases, closed some, lost others. Her hair grew longer, her hands rougher from field work. People in town still recognized her sometimes, the detective who solved the old Breyer case, and they'd thank her, offer free coffee, nod with a kind of reverence. But she never felt like a hero. Heroes end stories. Detectives just carry them. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after the arrest, she received a call from the prison warden. Eric Shaw had been found unresponsive in his cell. Heart failure, they said. No foul play suspected. The words landed without emotion. She thanked the warden and hung up. For a moment, she sat in silence, staring at the sunlight slanting through her blinds. Then she stood, grabbed her keys, and drove. She ended up at the quarry again, though she hadn't planned it. The land had grown over, wildflowers breaking through the disturbed soil. The air was thick with the scent of rain and earth. She stood there for a long time, her badge heavy in her pocket, and whispered the only words she could think of. "It's over." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Closure wasn't a door that slammed shut. It was a long, slow echo that faded with time. Back in town, the world went on. New officers joined the force, new cases filled the bulletin board, and the Delaney file was moved to the closed cabinet, its spine neat and dust-free. Laura kept the cup, though. It sat on her bookshelf, sealed in glass, not as a reminder of him, but as a reminder of what truth could survive. She looked at it sometimes when the nights grew too quiet, when the air felt heavy with memory. It reminded her that even after 20 years, even after love and betrayal and silence, the smallest thing, a discarded cup, a forgotten clue, could still change everything. And when people asked her later, in interviews or lectures, how she knew to reopen that particular case, she never gave them the real answer. She'd smile, say something about instinct or persistence. But the truth was simpler. She had felt a whisper in the evidence room that day, a pull she couldn't explain. Some voices she'd learned don't fade until they're heard. So she listened. She would always listen. Because every story, no matter how deeply buried, eventually speaks. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to hear it.